Good afternoon. I'm Martin Gillespie, an APM volunteer with Yorkshire and North Lincolnshire branch. Welcome to this webinar, Inclusive Impact, how to make sure disability isn't a barrier in your project. Please be aware this webinar is being recorded and you're in listen-only mode. The event is being delivered by APM Yorkshire and North Lincolnshire branch. We have some forthcoming networking events planned focused on emerging project professionals. You can get further information when it becomes available via our Twitter account. That's at APMYNL, at APMYNL. Also, if I take this opportunity to ask you if anybody has any suggestions for future CPD events, or you'd like to get involved with the branch, do get in touch with us. You'll find me, Martin Gillespie, and Mike Diskin, our chairman, on LinkedIn. This session will last for about 60 minutes. There'll be about 45 minutes of knowledge share, and then we'll conclude with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions via the questions panel, either during the webinar or at the end of the presentation, and I will address those to our speaker. Following the webinar, the recording will be uploaded onto our APM YouTube account, and the slides will be published on our APM SlideShare account, both of which will be listed on the branch community page on the APM website. Please allow 5 working days for this. And also don't forget that this session will count towards your CPD. Today, we're joined by Kaylee Chambers. Kaylee is a project manager with the NSPCC, and she also runs her own business, having previously worked in education and the fire and rescue service. She has a background in inclusive education and working with individuals who have SND, ASL or ASN. She's passionate about inclusion and uses her BA in Education Studies and broad work experience to apply this to project management. It gives me great pleasure to hand you over to Kaylee.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you for the introduction. I feel a little bit inadequate to introduce myself now, but thank you to the Yorkshire and North Lincolnshire branch for having me. My name is Kaylee Chambers and I am indeed a project manager at the NSPCC. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a white female in my mid-30s. I have long brown hair with a fringe and glasses, and today I'm presenting to you alone from my living room. I'm also based in England. I appreciate that not everyone attending today might be, so please bear that in mind when I mention things like the British Dyslexia Association or British Sign Language. Just to be clear, there's no pressure for audience participation today. If you have some questions, as Martin said, please put them in the question box and we've left some time at the end of the session. We'll be able to address those. And as Martin says, a copy of the slides and of this recording will be available to you later via the APM resources. So please don't feel any pressure to take notes as we're going either. You're welcome to, but you don't have to. Now, I would like to start by saying by no means do I claim to be an expert on diversity or inclusion. I am a project manager, and what I'm going to do today is share some of my personal and working experiences to help other project managers who are going through the same things. I sit on our organisational SEND forum. I'm an ally to our lived experience group organisationally, and prior to joining the NSPCC, I worked as a child protection specialist in a federated setting for children with SEND. Now, with that in mind, today's session is probably going to centre more around disability and neurodiversity, but there will be mention of considerations for other protected characteristics like gender or faith, perhaps. So, with the introduction out of the way, why are we here today and how does it impact us as project managers? Now, Ellie is going to be exceptionally helpful and put you up some Menti polls for us. So on the screen, you should see the next question coming up. Ellie, if you don't mind. Fabulous. Thank you very much. So the first question is, what is your role? If you're here, this will help. Oh, straight away, I like this. Project managers. If we know that the majority of people on the session today are project managers, then I can structure that content for you. And as much as we love our jobs as project managers, we might not have the organisational power to implement things that we want to do. So it helps me be able to advise what things are practical for you. Very good. Definitely predominantly project and programme management in here. Project team members and a few others. I'm quite intrigued by the others. I'll have to speak to some of you later. Lovely. This is really helpful. Thank you very much. Now, there's going to be 4 questions coming up next. On the next slides, I want to be very clear, they are anonymous. So please don't worry about getting an answer wrong. It's not about getting an answer wrong. It's about getting a baseline for what people already understand and where we need to go with today's session. So Ellie, if you don't mind moving us to the next slide. The next question is, what percentage of the British population is estimated to have dyslexia? I'll give you a couple of minutes to work that out. Oh, straight. Some of you are very quick. This is fabulous. Well done. Lovely. And again, I'm referencing British data purely because I'm based in England. So apologies to anyone that's coming from outside of the UK. Perfect. Now, the right answer is 15%. The British Dyslexia Association estimates that 15% of the population have dyslexia. And we're going to talk a little bit more about dyslexia later. But let's go on to the next question, if you don't mind, Ellie. So, how many people in the UK are estimated to have autism? What do you think here? Now, this data is taken from the National Autistic Society. So how many people do you think are estimated to have autism in the UK? Ah, you've jumped to the higher numbers. I like this. The first trick didn't work. But you are predominantly right. Yes, 700,000 people. According to the National Autistic Society, it's roughly 1 in 100 people have autism. Okay, question 3. Thank you very much, Ellie. In the 2021 England and Wales census, what percentage of people self-declared as having some form of disability? Working in percentages, you've got 5, 8, 15 and 18%. Now I'm going to be very honest with you. It was a decimal point number. I have rounded it to the nearest percentage in case anybody is going to pick me up on that one. Fabulous. I'll give you another second. Lovely. So, according to the 2021 England and Wales census, 17.7% of people self-declared as having some form of disability, and that equates to roughly 9.8 million people. Ellie, if you don't mind, let's have that final Menti slide. And so the final question is relating to something referred to as the purple pound. Now, for clarity, the purple pound is referring to the spending power of disabled households. So the question is, how much is the spending power of disabled households worth to UK businesses? We have 17 million, 17 billion, 247 billion and 330 billion. Good, some answers flying in there. Now, interestingly, and particularly for any of us that are working in sectors that are profit-based, the purple pound is estimated to be worth £247 billion to UK businesses. And this is really interesting because if we look at those numbers and the scope of this, we could, as project managers predominantly, at any time be working with a colleague who is deaf, for a sponsor who has dyslexia, for a customer with a physical disability, making a product for a child with autism. So this gives us an idea of how many people and how big this is. So when we want to make inclusive impact, there's a really big scope to do that. Thank you, Ellie. We'll leave the Menti there and we're going to get into the slide deck. So I'm going to share this screen for you. There we go. So I'm going to straight through to 2 more statistics for you. Now, these statistics come from a company called TextHelp. It's a company who produce assistive software like Read and Write. Now, what they've stated here in a really interesting session from June this year, if anyone gets a chance to go back and have a look at it, is that 1 in 5 people have a neurodivergent condition. And when they describe neurodivergent, they're stating that this could include things like attention deficit disorders, autism, dyslexia, and dyspraxia. And they also go on to state that 3 out of 4 people will not fully disclose their condition at work. Now, that might be because they fear that it would negatively impact career progression. They might fear some stigma. They might be unsure how to raise the issue, or even because they've had negative experiences in previous workplaces. If we can implement inclusive practice, then we reduce the onus on individual people making disclosures because we're normalising the support. So, between those 2 stats and the Menti polls, we know how many people are affected, but we know as project managers we have to answer to sponsors and to the C-suite. And so what are the business implications and the business benefits of being inclusive? Well, according to a piece that was created by Jill Horton and Martin McKay, this was called Building the Case for Neurodiversity and Creating Inclusive Experiences for All. It's also included a piece in the Harvard Business Review. The benefits for business of being inclusive include a positive impact on business objectives. That includes a 28% higher revenue, doubled net income, 30% higher profit margins. Siemens reported that neurodivergent employees increase the productivity of a company by almost as much as 50%, resulting in increased profits and customer satisfaction. Another benefit is better decision making. Companies who better embrace neurodiversity are 87% better at making decisions and 70% more likely to capture new markets. Attracting and retaining better talent. 76% of job seekers believe that a diverse workforce is a non-negotiable factor. And speaking of workforce, a more engaged workforce. 81% of employees who believe they work in an inclusive culture are also happy in their job. You may have also read the article by Professor Adam Bodison in the latest issue of Project 2. It had a great quote that I liked, which was, "Delivering projects in a way that is inclusive and respects people is not just morally right, but it actually improves project delivery." So I like to think of it as being inclusive allows individuals to bring their whole person to a project. Think of it as a project manager. If you were assigned a member to your team 3 days a week, you wouldn't want them only showing up for 2 days. And being inclusive is the same. You get the whole person and all of their capacity. Okay, something a little bit different now. There's a great account online that I have followed by a person called Mustafa Katultu. And I stumbled across it a while ago, but I think this makes a point really well. Think about making information available. Now, you're all professionals. I'm going to assume that you all use smartphones on an almost daily basis. And as project professionals, I also presume that you value efficiency and getting the most out of your resources. So iPhone users, did you know that if you are trying to select a piece of text on the screen, you can hold the spacebar and it will turn into a trackpad? Or Android users, to scroll between browser windows, you don't have to tap onto the little icon and open the different windows. You swipe the address bar and it will swipe through the windows. I bet a couple of you are probably trying that right now. The point is, if people don't know about something, they can't be expected to do it. So if you, as project managers, are not sharing the information in a way people can access, how do you expect your team members, customers, sponsors, stakeholders to know about it? One report stated that 56% of individuals have experienced communication barriers in their place of work. So imagine half your project team not properly understanding what you're asking them to do. So it's worth having a look at some language here. When I talk about accessibility, for me, and specifically in project terms, I'm asking, Is everybody able to give their best? Now, the list on screen is by no means exhaustive, but these are some examples of the many reasons people might not be able to access information in the same way as you. So let's look at a couple of them. The second bullet point down, lowercase/uppercase d for describing deaf is correct. According to the National Deaf Children's Society, deaf with a capital D refers to deaf children and adults who were born pre-lingually deaf, as in before they learned to talk. The deaf community can see itself as a linguistic and cultural minority group as opposed to a disabled group. The majority of deaf people in the UK will use British Sign Language as their first language, with English as a second or supplementary language. People who identify themselves as deaf with a lowercase d might only use BSL some of the time, and they may prefer to communicate using speech, gestures and other auditory equipment to assist them in a hearing society. So if we're wanting to be inclusive, we should always use lowercase and uppercase d for the deaf. When we think about other things in terms of accessing information, did you know that approximately 10% of the population is estimated to use English as a second or additional language? Or literacy, for example. The average reading age in the UK is 9 years old. Think about that in terms of your marketing, your comms. Now, if we tried to address each of the things on screen individually, it would become really overwhelming. So instead, what we're going to do today is take some principles or best practice and apply it to everything that we do. And that's going to apply to our external facing work, but also work with colleagues or stakeholders or other agencies. And there's a really lovely image that I like to use at this point, and I'm sure you'll have seen it before, talking about the difference between equality and equity. For me, equality is about giving people the same thing. Equity is about giving people the same opportunity. Now, whilst we're speaking about language, neurodiversity is another word that you'll hear a lot. Neurodiversity is around recognising the diversity in the functioning of the human brain. It goes on to say that no style of neurocognitive function is right or wrong. It's rather that all brains are different and they function accordingly. You may also hear the term neurotypical, and that's more likely to be used to describe brain function that is similar to the majority of society for the element you are considering. Now, back in May 2022, there's an author called Tanya Masterman, and she enlisted the help of her husband to help illustrate the distinction between neurodiverse and neurodivergent and how to use that terminology in a supportive way. Now, image description. You see an image with 4 frames on it. Frame 1 is a sketch of 4 human heads. The first has a blue brain with the word OCD. The second has a green brain that says ADHD. The third has a purple brain with the word dyslexia. And the fourth has an orange brain with the word autism. The text below reads, each of these people is neurodivergent. There are lots of ways to be neurodivergent. Frame 2 is a drawing of one human head with a yellow brain with the letters NT. And the text reads, this person is neurotypical. Frame 3 is a drawing of 4 human heads, all with green brains and the word ADHD. And the text reads, these people are neurodivergent, but the group itself is not neurodiverse. And frame 4 is a drawing of 9 smaller heads, each with different coloured brains. And the text reads, this is a neurodiverse group. The text on screen reads, a group can be neurodiverse, an individual cannot. And that image really helped me put into context how we use language like neurodiverse and neurodivergent. Now, society has long since moved away from a medical model of disability. Medical models viewed disability as a problem or a barrier owned by the individual. Now, the social model that we employ means that the person isn't disabled by their condition, but by the barriers that society puts in place. So as a very crude example, a person in a wheelchair is not impeded from entering a building where a ramp is the societal norm. The barrier is when society made stairs the norm. Now, there's a misconception that if people are in a professional role, they can't have a specific learning need, be neurodivergent, have a disability or a mental health need. But in reality, as project managers or project team members, it is highly likely that we are in fact working with colleagues, stakeholders, sponsors and managers who may have an additional need. So today we're going to look at how we apply this best practice to our project work in these 4 specific areas: project documents, project meetings, in-person events, and the actual products and services that we create. So let's make a start and let's look at documents. So here, if you're creating documents, is a list of do's and don'ts. As I said, these slides will be available, so don't worry about note taking. First off, fonts. Use sans serif fonts if possible, because they're recommended by the British Dyslexia Association. And ensure that there is sufficient contrast between the background and the text. And speaking of backgrounds, use plain backgrounds, no patterns. And here's an example. The image description is a bright red background with swirly light blue font. It's very difficult to read. Now, this is an example of how visual glare may feel for readers with dyslexia, ocular migraines, visual impairment, colour blindness, or any other condition. That same information is also given to you on this slide. The image description is the same information about dyslexia shown in a sans serif font in dark blue, with spacing between text boxes and a pie chart image indicating 15%. So if you were trying to share information, presenting it in an inaccessible format is about as much use as locking it in a box. Your audience can't access it and they're not going to do what you need them to. It goes back to that earlier example of functions on our phones. If they don't have the information, people can't do it. Now, whilst I'm using dyslexia as an example, what about this? I'm going to give you a sentence on the next screen. Just try reading it to yourself. Now, your brain is really smart. It doesn't actually read each letter in a word. We also don't read in smooth lines. A person's eyes make short, sharp jumps, so the brain actually predicts what it thinks will be coming up, particularly with 2- and 3-letter words. The brain works as more of a best guess engine, so it scans the shape of the word. That is why font, underlining and italics are important, because they change the expected shape of the words and letters and make it harder to read. Now, back to our list. So, use corporate templates if you have them. If you don't, speak to your brand team, creative team, studio, marketing, whoever is making content, and see about agreeing a set of principles for your materials. I've got another example for you here. If I wanted to share with you some top tips for a dyslexia-friendly workspace, are you more likely to understand this slide, which again is that dark blue sans serif font on a white background with bullet points, or genuinely one of the design ideas suggested by Microsoft for the same slide you just saw? Now, it's put white text on a black background. There are illustrations of circles and squiggly lines, and the text is small. The actual information I want you to take away is the smallest content on the screen. So if you don't have a corporate template, speak to your relevant teams and agree some principles. It makes your outputs more accessible, consistent, and professional looking. Okay, back to the list again. If you are adding images, ensure that they are accompanied with alt text descriptions so that users who rely on screen reader software will get the description. Similarly, if you cut and paste text as an image, like a screenshot, or if you use tables, the screen reader software might not be able to read this, and again, users are missing out on information. Try to avoid writing in columns, like in newspapers. Instead, try to use bullet points, and where possible, keep your text concise. Think of the Plain English campaign, which is definitely worth a look if you haven't seen it before. And then with images, think really carefully about the images that you use. Make sure they are adding to, not distracting from, your message. but also, are those images representative and are they diverse? Now let's have a look at project meetings now. So the first thing I would say is to consider access from the outset. Ask your team members if they need anything, or add a line to invites that says, if you have any accessibility needs, please let me know. But be sure to pay attention, because it's no use asking for those needs and then ignoring them, or only making the changes in the first meeting and forgetting about it. Secondly, an agenda. Now, agendas can really help reduce anxiety. We'll talk about that in a second, but it also allows people to judge whether they can add value to your meeting or whether they can make better use of their own time by sending an update. Providing an agenda allows individuals to know what's expected of them. So imagine you are going to a party. You don't know the theme, the location, what time to arrive, or who will be there. So what do you do? What do you wear? Do you eat before you go? Do you take a bottle? The anxiety before the party can be removed if the invite or agenda is worded properly. So don't change it either. If you're just about to knock on the front door dressed as a minion, you don't want to find out that fancy dress was cancelled. And similarly, try to avoid sending ambiguous appointment titles. For some users, the appointment title of quick chat can really increase anxiety. So make sure that you're clear. Quick chat about catering for the development day will allow people to both prepare and reduce their anxiety. Allow people to contribute in whatever way suits them best. Now, emails or Teams messages might allow people more time for a considered response. We have all thought of the perfect comeback 10 minutes after we've had an argument with our other half. So if you're giving people more time to consider their responses, you're more likely to get a better response, which is preferable. Now, for some individuals who have anxiety or body dysmorphia or depression and so on, looking at their own reflection on the camera can be incredibly distracting and stress-inducing. So if video isn't essential, don't demand it in virtual calls. But if an attendee relies on lip reading or a sign language interpreter, make sure that videos are on to speak and that speakers introduce themselves by name each time before they speak. So it's also good practice to have captions on. If you use Teams, you'll know that they're inbuilt in PowerPoint as well. If everybody has their captions on, it helps catch any weird and wonderful mistranslations, and the group can address them in real time rather than leaving that one person with an additional need out of the loop and confused. You can also use that transcription function in Teams. You can encourage people to use their hands up to speak rather than talking over each other, because that's very difficult for people to follow. And some people will find it difficult to take notes during a call if they're trying to lip read or watch an interpreter, or even if they have a process delay. So providing a recording or notes, like we did at the start of today's session, will help ease that as well. Again, like we did today, give a basic visual description of the speakers for any attendees with a visual impairment. This can help to add context to the speaker and their information. If you are asking for feedback, make a specific method and time by which the person should respond. Again, this allows for processing and therefore a more useful answer, but it also sets clear expectations and the person understands what is required of them. If possible, share documents in advance so that people have processing time or can make them accessible. And that might include screen tint, large print, screen reader software, translations, or any other number of things. In long meetings, allow a break of 15 minutes every 2 hours. Now that can support users with physical health needs who perhaps need to eat or use the toilet regularly. Be aware that any sign language interpreters are likely to need to swap over every 15 minutes or so avoid back-to-back meetings. Back-to-back meetings can be exhausting for individuals for a variety of reasons. Lip reading is one of them. But it might also be that colleagues need opportunity to take medication or to pray. And describe PowerPoint slides or screen shares. Don't rely on people being able to see the content. As we've said, did you know PowerPoint has inbuilt caption capabilities? Now, as with all captions, they're not 100% accurate, but they are a very good start. Now, those meeting tips are useful predominantly for virtual, because a lot of us are living in that world now, and some of those theories go into in-person meetings as well. So let's have a look at in-person events themselves. So first off, think about physically. How do people access the space? Is there disabled parking? Are there lifts, handrails, ramps? Are there accessible toilet rooms and changing spaces? Are there prayer spaces? Is there a fire evacuation procedure for everybody, including fire alarms for deaf people? If someone needs to take medication, is there a space for them to do so? Is there an option for anybody who might be breastfeeding to go and pump? There's a variety of things you might need to consider. And I'm going to show you 2 rooms. For you to have a think, of these 2 rooms, which would you rather have a meeting in? So, room number 1, the visual description is a office room, meeting room, with a plain wooden table in the centre. There are 7 matching black office chairs arranged around the table, and there's a screen headed at the sighted at the head of the table. Option 2, the visual description is another meeting room of similar size. A wooden table sits at the centre with 12 matching red chairs around the table. A flip chart sits at the side of the room, but each place setting at the table has paper, pen, cup, saucer and a glass. In the centre of the table, there's a bowl of fresh fruit, a bottle of water, 2 jugs of hot drink and 3 plate servings of pastries and snacks. So, which would you rather be in, room 1 or room 2? So most of you will have obviously chosen room 2, a room full of fruit and snacks, teas, coffees, water readily available. Well, those things were available in room 1, but you didn't ask for them, so technically it was your responsibility. Now, obviously, of course, I'm being facetious, but it's a very clear metaphor. If you have an attendee who needs a space to pray, to pump breast milk or take medication, they might not be comfortable asking. But if you make those things available from the outset, you put people in a better starting position and they can better focus on work you're asking of them. And just to point out, this does not mean that you have to provide a breast milk pumping room at every meeting. You will know what is needed if you set those communications up earlier, like we said, and asked for any access needs. So back to our list, other things to think about. Be aware of sensory distractions. Now, sounds, heat, itchy chairs, flickering lights can all be hugely distracting for a variety of conditions and audiences. The sound of an overhead projector, for example, I know, very old school. In a meeting room of 8 of you, you might not notice it, or the fan in your laptop might not distract you. But for users with sensory sensitivity or even hearing aids, for example, that could be really off-putting. In the meeting or event space, is there actually space for everyone to manoeuvre around furniture, including people with wheelchairs, walking frames or such like? Are tables an appropriate height for attendees? If a sign language interpreter is attending, make sure they're not stood in front of the window because it's going to create a shadow. Make sure the interpreter can be seen in the eye line of the presentation because individuals don't want to have to flit their eye line between the presenter and the interpreter. If you do have a sign language interpreter or 2, be conscious of how you introduce them. Saying something like, "This is Jane, she's here because John is deaf," puts the onus on John. In reality, Jane is here because you don't understand sign language. John can't do anything about being deaf, but you can do something about learning signs, so who should the onus be on? So, if you're hosting an event or you're creating content, think about whether it needs to be in English, sign language, or even captioned. And if you're using sign language, particularly in the UK, think about regional dialects of sign language in your audience, presenter, and interpreters. For example, if you're using an interpreter who uses a Scottish dialect of BSL, audiences in Wales might not be able to understand all of the content. And finally, We're going through the life cycle of our project. We have set up some documents, we've pulled the team together, we've held some in-person events, and now we're actually creating some products or services. So what do we need to think about here? First of all, it saves time and money to scope your access needs out at the beginning. Producing a marketing video, but forgetting to leave space for captions is going to cost you a lot to have to reshoot that video. Think about your testing schedule. Think about who will be involved in testing. Is your testing pool representative of the user group? For example, did you know that in the case of car collisions, women are 3 times more likely than men to receive whiplash? It's thought to be because of the different musculature in the neck. Now, I want to put a note in at this point to state that this information is taken from Caroline Criado Perez's book, Invisible Women, and I'm quoting her text when I describe 2 genders. I fully acknowledge the spectrum of genders and identities, but this data is looking at car safety and has traditionally been in binary categories. So with that in mind, did you also know that in the EU, there are 5 safety tests a car has to pass before being allowed on the market, and they model 5 different collision types? But in none of those is an anthropomorphically female crash test dummy used. In fact, 3 of the 5 tests stipulate that a 50th centile male dummy must be used. So 50% of the users, and those more likely to be injured, are not represented in the testing. And we haven't even looked at the needs of pregnant people or those with physical disabilities. So when you design your testing or focus groups, are you actually taking feedback from representative users? With that, is your data disaggregated? Let's say 80% of respondents say that they really enjoyed your product or session. But what if all of the 20% who didn't were disabled? Are you identifying this in your testing and feedback data? And traditionally, there's been a real lack of disaggregated data, which aside from the obvious marginalisation of certain groups, could pose real massive risks for your product in the future. Another interesting fact from the same book, and this is a quote, when a female Viagra was trialled, it recruited 25 trial participants. 23 of them were male. So, if you are launching a product, let's say a book, are you making visually impaired readers wait 4 months for the large print version? Let's put it differently. Are you offering a different level of service or product or access to a person because of their protected characteristic? If you are delivering a product in Wales, for example, I see most of you are based in the UK, consider that need to be producing bilingual materials. Now, if you are, bring English, Welsh and sign language advisors in at the stage of script writing. It is making so much more work for yourself to produce an English version and just send it for translation. There's one example that I had on a project last year. I learned there was no one Welsh word for grandparents. So you don't want to have to go back and amend that 10-second video voiceover that's already been signed off because you now have to fit 6 extra words in those 10 seconds. Now, if you're doing any marketing or promotion for a launch, particularly on social media, please capitalise your hashtags. Anyone using screen reader software or read aloud functions relies on the computer to separate the words, and you don't want the issue that Susan Boyle had when she launched a new album a few years ago. Now, I apologise for anybody that may be offended by this. This is not made up. This is a genuine tweet that went out from Susan's management and account. It could have been a lot clearer if they capitalised the hashtag. Now, on that note, although it feels like an odd note to move from, a few top tips for you to take away. First off, consider your access from the outset. Rather than have it as an add-on where you have to adapt existing materials, building access in from the outset is cheaper. For example, including captions in videos at the point of creation saves having your videos reproduced, even going as far as leaving a space at the bottom of your planned video shot so the captions don't get interrupted by the image behind them. Secondly, we've learned a lot of these things through experience. I learned about visual descriptions of speakers when I joined a different webinar. So if you learn something, model it. You'd be surprised how many colleagues will have had the proverbial light bulb moment and then they'll adopt it too. Even better if your C-suite or senior leaders model it as well. But don't reinvent the wheel. There's plenty of projects and services in your industry that will have gone before you and will have spent time, money and effort learning things so you don't have to. It can be a mine of information, so check with your doc controller, the library, the lessons learned or your PMO to see if there's anything you can draw from. And if there isn't, start one. Many users might use screen read software, as I mentioned earlier, but there's a whole host and marketplace of assistive technology. Things like Dragon, Text Help Read and Write, for example. Senior leaders and those with the ability to make these decisions can demonstrate inclusivity by giving all staff access to technology site-wide, rather than rely on individuals requesting it individually one at a time. And on that, if you feel that you or anyone you work with has a disability or physical or mental health need that affects them at work in the UK, be sure to check out the Access to Work initiative. So this is a government-funded initiative that can help provide funding for specialist support for people who have those needs in work. Now, that's an awful lot of information, and as I said, I don't expect you to take notes going through the session. All of those slides and this recording will be available to you to take away, share with your colleagues, and try and implement some of those things in your own practice if you're not already doing so. Now, hopefully we've got a little bit of time left for some questions. So Martin, if I hand over to you and see if we've got any questions to answer.
Right, okay, thank you, Kaylee. I've got one for you. If anybody else would like to enter their questions in the question section, I'll give you a moment to do that. So, Kaylee, you've been through lots of stuff today, and lots of information. What do you think are the first steps to implementing this if I'm in an organisation that doesn't have very much of that in place?
It's going to be tricky because we're going to, obviously in this audience, you're going to have project managers who are in really small organisations, and you're probably going to be able to implement change a little bit quicker. And some of you are going to be in organisations that are national, if not multinational, and implementing change more broadly is going to take a lot longer. So the first steps I would say is that modelling. So go back to the communications you're sending out. Make sure that you're using the fonts, the backgrounds. Look at your email background, for example. When you're sending a calendar appointment, make sure that you're adding an agenda or a subject and adding those things. Add your pronouns to your email signature. On your appointments, add a little line that says, if you have any access needs, please get in touch. And start modelling those things, because as other people see that, they will adopt it. If you are in a smaller organisation and you have the ability to implement change a little bit broader or a little bit quicker, then absolutely take this to senior managers, speak to your HR or your people ops directorate, speak to your senior managers, your marketing, your comms, and see if there can be some sort of brand guidance or accessibility guidance that you can implement, almost like a statement of intent from your business. So my advice would be model it to start with, and then if you've got the opportunity, step that up the ladder and see if you can get some sponsors to take it on with you. Thank you, Martin.
Right, thanks, Kelly. There's some extra ideas for us there. It's more of a statement, but somebody said that their mind's completely blown by all this information, and they had no idea really about lots of these things, and they'd always thought that if it looked good, that's really all they needed to do. But I think you've sort of shown us that it needs to be more than just looking good.
That's a really good point, and to be honest, it can be terrifyingly overwhelming, because I've waffled at you for 45 minutes and there's a couple of responses. Part of us goes, oh my god, I'm awful, how did I not know all this, I'm really bad, I should have known this, I've done a bad job. The other part of us thinks, well, there's too much there for me to even start with, so I'm just going to carry on as I was. The important thing is none of us know all of it to start with. Nobody does. And just because somebody has one level of access, so let's say somebody is a wheelchair user, doesn't mean they know everything about captions and sign language interpreters and the needs of somebody who might be deaf. So actually we're all learning, and even if we take one thing away and implement it, that's one thing more than there was before. So it is quite mind-blowing, and a lot of it is very new and can be quite overwhelming, and especially when we don't have lived experience of it, what looks good to us might not look good to someone with a visual impairment or ocular migraines or different conditions. So it's a case of one bit at a time, because it's better than not doing a bit at a time as well. Yeah.
Thanks. One from one of my colleagues here at North Yorkshire Council. We do equality impact assessments at the very initial stages of the project. So she says, how can we make equality impact assessments better? And it would be great if we could see examples from other organisations. Well, obviously we can't do that today, but are there any sort of forums that we could perhaps get involved with to sort of consider things like that?
That is brilliant in two ways, and I'll try and do that in two stages. So the first part of how do we make them better, how do we make the assessments better? First off is who wrote it? What's it looking at? Because again, we go back to that idea of we can't ask a person in a wheelchair about experiences for people who are visually impaired, because they haven't necessarily got that lived experience. Let's not lump everybody together who has an accessibility need, disability or neurodivergency in one group. So who wrote the assessment and who carries out the assessment? That's the first thing that I would say. I had the benefit to have some time with an amazing consultancy firm down south called Listen Up, and we described one of our pieces of work as evidence-based. So we're confident in it because it's evidence-based. And the CEO just did that thing where they ask a question and it blows everything you've known out of the water, and he just went, but what's the evidence based on? And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, is the evidence, we were talking about some children-facing work, is the evidence based on your white, middle-class, rural primary school one-form entry? Because if so, the evidence is not relevant to some of the settings you're wanting to apply it to. And we went, yeah, that's a really good point. So if you have evidence or you have assessments, think about who wrote it, what it looks at, and who decides what it looks at, who's scaling and rating that is the first thing. The second thing about sharing best practice, 100%. So it depends on your industry, because your assessment is going to look at different things. North Lincs Council, for example, might get in touch with the disability leads or the access needs at North Yorkshire, at City of York Council, at North East Links, at Hull and East Riding, and do a little development day. Let's theme that as a development day. Let's bring all of our risk assessments, our evaluations, all these assessments that we're looking at, and let's share some best practice. Let's potentially coordinate on some of this and make sure that we're getting the best information. The other thing that you can do is look at the national organisation websites. So things like the National Autistic Society, the Deaf Children's Association, all those ones I've listed today, the British Dyslexia Association. And there is a hive of information for professionals, for families, for individuals. So check out all the stuff online for those, and they'll give you some really useful templates or things to include and things to put in your assessments as well. Sorry, Martin, that was a very long answer to that question.
It was, but yeah. Lots of information there, thank you. We've got a couple more questions in. The image descriptions you demonstrated were very good. It seems like a practice skill. Has it been easy to add that into your presentations, and what has the feedback been like?
You know what? No, it's not a practice skill. It is a very new skill that I am still getting used to doing. I'll be 100% honest with you. The image descriptions, because I am, not had a lived experience of a visual impairment, and so I have always relied on seeing what I could see on screen. And it was only when somebody else modelled it, and the same with the description of myself, that I went, oh my God, yeah, of course, absolutely. I've been really quite ignorant to have not thought about that. And so the practice of, I'm going to deliver this as if somebody's not looking at the screen, just turn the screen off and try and talk to them. And all of a sudden, if what I'm saying doesn't make sense without the image, then I need to describe it. But it is not a practiced skill, and it is very much still being practiced. So glad that came across well. And the feedback so far has been one of those, oh, actually, that's a really quick change I can implement immediately. It costs me nothing, and I can implement that straight away. That's a real quick win to put in. So that's generally been the feedback so far.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you, Kay. Another one. She says, thank you so much for all of the information, and it's very helpful. My question's around introducing some of these factors part way through a project.
Mm-hmm.
You shared the importance of making considerations at the start. Do you have any suggestions as the best way to introduce more accessibility once the project's already underway?
Yeah, I emphasise it from the start because particularly when we think in project terms, we're thinking about our budgets and did we scope it out at the beginning and have we built a budget for captions on the video of the marketing campaign and that kind of stuff. But the actual quick win stuff, you know, the adding a line to the invites, the changing your fonts or your documents, making sure that you're not writing in columns, that you're using bullet points, you can do that at any point, and it doesn't, almost doing it halfway through the project puts more of a spotlight on it because people will notice the change. So some of it, project specific, when you're looking at budgets and things like that, can be harder to implement halfway through, but they're justifiable as well. So conversations with your sponsor, with your project board, with whatever governance structure you have of, do you know what, we need £5,000 now because we need to add this on, we need an extra 3 weeks for the video production. If we don't do that, when we launch in 6 months' time, it's going to cost us £15,000 because we'll have already released the contract with the video producer. We're going to have to get them back in and create a whole separate version. So it's easier from the beginning, especially with the big project stuff, but it's absolutely doable halfway, and you can justify and rationalise why those things need to be done.
Right, that's good. Another one, thank you so much for this extremely insightful and useful webinar. Do you have any additional materials you could share with us for further knowledge development, books, website, people, podcasts, or anything else?
Oh, there's so many things. So one of the great things that I really liked, so as I said, Tanya Masterman is the author that did some of the illustrations about neurodivergency. She's fantastic. That was really helpful. It sounds daft, but the British Dyslexia Association has a style guide. I would absolutely put that in front of your creative studio marketing team, whoever you're doing, because that will look at things like spacing between words. I didn't even get onto that today. Spacing between words, font types, backgrounds, all that kind of stuff. So I would definitely recommend that for those of you that are based in the UK. Or even if you're not, the guidance is still relevant. But there are a whole host of things. The one thing I would be careful about is what we've looked at today is inclusion, and I've used disability as the general theme, but it's not just about disability, because yes, providing someone a room to take their medication in could also apply to a prayer space, and the same reason we don't do back-to-back meetings might be because somebody needs time to pray, but they might also need time to eat because it's a fasting period or whatever, you know, whatever that might be. So it's not necessarily just about disability, so there's not really one podcast or amazing book. But I would say, yeah, have a look out there and you'll find it trickles on really, really well. But check out the websites, British Dyslexia Association, the Autism Society, Deaf Children's Society, Ambitious About Autism. There's absolutely loads of them out there, and they're all really keen to help and support professionals move this forward.
Sounds like lots of sources of support there, so thank you for listing those. Yeah, I don't think we've got any more questions now, so on behalf of APM Yorkshire and North Lincolnshire branch, I'd like to thank you, Kaylee, very much for your presentation.
Thank you so much for having me, Martin. It's been a real pleasure, and thank you to everyone for giving up their lunch times to come along. But yeah, my details are on there, and if anyone wants to reach out on LinkedIn or anything we can help in the future, please, yeah, just get in touch. Yeah,
it's been, you know, lots of information there, and I think we've all got something to take away for sort of next steps and ideas that we'd like to carry forward. And there are lots of thank yous coming through on the questions now as well. So
thank you very much.
They're all adding to what I've been saying. So that's great. Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone for attending.